The 17th lesson of our depth study looks at the last component of life in Nazi Germany and the coordination of the people into Nazi society known as the Volksgemeinschaft, when it evaluates workers, farmers, and businesses, with a little bit at the end where I talk about whether or not the Nazis were able to transform German society. Hitler and the Nazis had come to power in large part, you need to remember, because they had promised to use radical methods to solve the country's main two problems. That is the unemployment of factory workers, the working class and blue-collar workers, and those of the problems faced by German farmers who had suffered crisis after crisis throughout the period of the 1920s. Were largely, let's just say, unaffected by the benefits of the golden years of the Weimar Republic. So as a consequence of this, and it needs to be seen that in return for work, most Germans gave up their political freedom. Early on, Germans felt that this was worth it, but did that stay the same? And did Germans eventually say by 1939 that giving up their political freedom to the Nazis in return for these sort of economic benefits was what was worth it? So we're going to sort of evaluate that fact. The first component of the Nazis attacking or trying to solve Germany's problems deals with the transformation of the economy in 1933 to 1936. And the title of this slide is a man's name, Hjalmar Schacht. He's a brilliant economist. He was in large part had a lot to do with sort of the successes of the Weimar Republic before the Great Depression. And Hitler put Schacht in charge of Germany's finances. Schacht realizes that in order to save Germany from the Depression, he needs to fund a huge program of work creation. And he called this the New Plan. I'm going to stop you right there and say, throughout this particular PowerPoint, I've highlighted a number of different things you should know. So when you're making your notes, you're thinking about it, you need to understand that the things highlighted could come up in the form of questions or should be used in your responses to maximize full points. The first one of those, of course, is the National Labor Service. This is something Schacht created. It's sending men on public works projects and conservation programs. The biggest of these programs was the building of a national network of motorways known as the Autobahn program. Germany builds the first and most advanced highway system in the world, and is really ahead of other countries in this respect. It's a massive make-work project. The Autobahns were mostly made by hand so that more labor could be used, and that they limited the use of machines so that man-hours could be spent building these so that Germans had a job. The railways in Germany are extended. Some are built entirely, new ones are built from scratch. The S-Bahn system built through Berlin is a really good example of this. There's also a major house building program. New public buildings are built, the biggest of which is the Reichschancellor in Berlin. Other famous public work schemes, including the buildings surrounding the 1936 Berlin Olympics, or the Nazi Party rally stage in Nuremberg, as examples of major public works projects brought on by Hjalmar Schacht. Hitler will also start to direct the economy towards rearmament. In 1935, Hitler will reintroduce conscription, which is a mandatory service in the German army. By 1936, he will cancel the New Plan and actually replace Schacht with Hermann Göring, a loyal Nazi, and create what's known as the Four-Year Plan. And the goal of the Four-Year Plan was to get the German economy ready for war. Conscription has the benefit of reducing unemployment, and the need for new weapons in the Four-Year Plan and the equipment and the uniforms for the soldiers will mean that there are more jobs created in coal mines and steel mills and textile mills to feed the need of the rearmament in the German army. Additionally, Hitler will build a world-class air force, the Luftwaffe, which will give firms having to do with the aeroplane industry a huge boost. All of these measures together brought an economic recovery and boosted national pride. Germany goes from having employment hovering around 25 to 30% to 0% unemployment by 1936. Germany has rebuilt their army, and the Germans start to feel extremely good about themselves. They start to feel that their country was finally emerging from the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, and it was becoming a great power once again, the type of power it had once been before the First World War and before the humiliation that Hitler, of course, had manipulated in many ways to come to power. Therefore, you would assume generally that the Nazis and the workers would have a very, very good relationship. But in reality, that relationship is mixed, and it's really essential to look at two sides. So let's look at the first side first, okay? The Nazis, number one, of course, thought that the workers were incredibly important. They were. They were needed to create the industries that would help make Germany the world power that Hitler had wanted. They needed these people to help build the weapons Germany needed to go to war, to become that world power. Therefore, he focused on winning the loyalty of the workers by having a variety of really interesting initiatives. The first one, of course, is common throughout. He uses propaganda. The propaganda of the Nazis praises the workers, and it tries to associate the workers with Hitler. Most commonly, though, there are three particular schemes in which the workers could benefit from, meant to let's just say, benefit the German workers. The first one is strength through joy, the KDF. That's a German abbreviation for strength through joy. Strength through joy gives workers cheap theater tickets, organized courses, so that they can train up and get more skills. It gives them trips and sporting events, tickets to sporting events, and even cut price cruises on luxury liners. Strength through joy is the whole idea that the workers will work hard to build this new Germany if they are happy. And the Nazis provide them with a whole bunch of leisure activities, including cut-rate vacations, and in some cases, for certain groups of workers, depending on their importance, free vacations. Vacations Germans had never had before. The opportunity to go to the Baltic coast and go to a beach resort, the opportunity to cruise the Mediterranean. These were things that Strength Through Joy provided. Another popular program was the Volkswagen Beetle program. Workers were given 5 marks a week, or rather, they gave up 5 marks a week from their paycheck. And this was held by the state and paid into a state scheme. And this money would be collected, and then the Germans would be given access to a cheap car known as the Volkswagen Beetle, or the people's car. It became a symbol of the new prosperous Germany. Lastly, there was a movement known as the Beauty of Labor movement. And this was a movement meant to increase the betterment of the working conditions. It's fair to say that factories in the 1930s were not necessarily great places to work. The Beauty of Labor movement saw for the first time the installation of washing facilities, changing facilities, and low-cost canteens where workers could go and have a nice square meal paid for, or at least subsidized by the German government, so that they were working on full bellies, something that, of course, for workers living paycheck to paycheck wasn't necessarily always the case. And of course, all opportunities to pump this up by Nazi propaganda were used. You see here on the left an example of the KDF wagon. That's the Volkswagen Beetle, and how Germans were to benefit it. One small point in the Volkswagen Beetle, only a couple thousand Germans ever got this. In fact, the war interrupted the production of the Volkswagen Beetle. But nevertheless, it became a massive propaganda thing. And for whatever reason, is one of the sticking features. Oh, yes, the people got a car, therefore it was good, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, not that many got a car, but a lot of people put money away for it. That money was then promptly used for the war later on. But anyhow, that's neither here nor there. And then, of course, here's a lovely Aryan family going on vacation, earned through strength, through joy, again, propped up by the Nazis. On the other hand, it wasn't all, let's just say, great for the workers. The workers did lose out in some respects, and this needs to be balanced against the successes when determining whether or not they were successful in coordinating or getting the workers on their side. The trade-off for the workers primarily was the loss of their political representation. The workers had overwhelmingly and always voted for the SDP. When political parties were banned in 1933, the SDP, of course, being a left-leaning party, was banned immediately, and the workers lost their representation in that respect. Also, equally important was the loss of their trade unions. The trade unions had represented the workers in negotiations with big business. And as a consequence, when this trade unions were banned in 1933, many workers resented this, and they worried about how they were going to improve their life. To replace the trade union, the Nazis created something known as the German Labor Front, or the DAF, led by a rather interesting man named Dr. Robert Ley. If you want to hear some interesting stories about him, ask me in class. This was an organization meant to replace trade unions and help workers, but in reality, it kept strict control of them. It refused to let them strike for better pay and conditions. In some areas, workers were even prevented from moving to better paid jobs because the German Labor Front wouldn't let them. It made them stay in jobs that actually were much poorer. Wages throughout this time, because the German Labor Front never pushed companies for more wages, remained relatively low. Though it's fair to say prices didn't increase massively because they were strictly controlled, so people didn't necessarily struggle to make ends meet in that respect, but they struggled to get ahead in life. And most Nazis, or rather most workers under the Nazis, found themselves not very much better off in 1939 than they had been in real terms in 1933. Therefore, by the late 1930s, there was lots of grumbling amongst the workers. Their standard of living was lower in some cases than before the Depression, and mandatory things like listening to one of Hitler's speeches sometimes in many cases weren't attended because people were just generally dissatisfied with the representation they'd received under the German Labor Front. The Nazis and the farmers are an interesting comparison as well. The farmers were, of course, again, massively important to the Nazi rise to power. And as a consequence of this, Hitler realized that he needed to appease the farmers when he came to power, and he comes up with two particular ideas. The first one is known as the Reichsfood Estate, and this was put under a man named Richard Daré, who was actually supposedly to be in charge of Britain had it been ever invaded and conquered by the Nazis. But anyhow, he was in charge of the Reichsfood Estate. Anyways, make a long story short, this is a board, and this board bought all of the things produced by farmers in Germany and then distributed all of this to markets across Germany. This was good in some respects because it gave farmers a guaranteed market for their produce. They no longer had to go search out people to buy them. The government bought everything and then just distributed it to the people. So that was good in that respect. The other thing was known as the Reich entailed farm law. And this was meant to protect peasants from losing their farms. Peasants had lost a lot of their farms during the Great Depression, and the Germans didn't want that to continue. It meant that banks couldn't seize the land if the German peasants could not afford to pay the loans and mortgages on it. Therefore, it ensured that the peasants stayed on their land. But it also had a racial aim. The Germans talked about blood and soil, the fact that there was some sort of mystical connection between the Aryans and the land and the farms, and that the farmers were the basis of the German master race. Therefore, to be the backbone of the German master race, there needed to be farmers. Therefore, the Reich's entailed farm law was about keeping as many farmers farming as there was before. Well, not only that, they wanted these people to farm the East. Therefore, they needed to have a way to protect the way of life of farmers that was being, I guess, encroached upon by the damage of the Depression in modern life, etc., etc. However, on the other hand, like industrial workers, some peasants were not necessarily thrilled with either of the regime's two laws. First of all, the Reichsfood Estate meant that efficient, ambitious farmers were held back. They couldn't get more, they couldn't find new markets, and they'd have to basically use the same process as less efficient farmers. So in other ways, it did not reward those who worked hard because everybody got the same price. The Reich's entailed farm law also meant that banks were unwilling to lend money for farmers. So very counterintuitively, in order to protect farmers and make them better, farmers, of course, did need to borrow from time to time. Tractors are expensive, material is expensive, and just like sometimes you can't just walk in and buy a car, you have to get a loan to get a car, farmers would have to get a loan to buy tractors and material for their farms. Therefore, when banks wouldn't lend it, it meant that farmers were under pressure to get the stuff they needed to do their job on their farms. It also meant, too, interestingly enough, that only the eldest child could inherit the farm, which in a sense decreased the amount of people who stayed on farms, because since the eldest child could only inherit the farm now, it meant that for many second and third and fourth children, they left the farms to find better pay in the cities and industry because they had no future on the land. Only their eldest brother did. What you get as a consequence of this is very much something contrary to the Nazis' wants. They were actually unsuccessful with farmers. The rural areas depopulate 3% per year throughout the 1930s, which was completely the opposite of the Nazis' aims. The middle classes are another interesting one. Again, with the middle classes, you see the record of the Nazis being rather mixed. business people, those people who own small industrial or engineering plants, were generally grateful to the Nazis for eliminating the communist threat to their businesses and property. Of course, we know that the communists, had they come to power, would have seized all of the businesses and property and redistributed them amongst the people with no private ownership. Therefore, they were happy that this was prevented. But on the other hand, they also liked the order that the Nazis brought. The middle class generally liked order and resented the chaos of the Great Depression and the Weimar years to a good extent. However, the small business owners saw mixed results. As I mentioned earlier, the small engineering firms, those that maybe had a connection to the rearmament programs, did quite well under the Nazis. But the shop owners, or those that produced consumer goods, because these were not valued by the government, these people struggled. Large department stores, which had been a big problem, and Hitler in the 1920s had talked about trying to stop the large department stores, and particularly associated with the Jews, from buying up German businesses. And these department stores, mostly owned by Germans in Germany, that is, not Aryan Germans, still were taking business away from local shops and buying them up and crushing the high street in favor of the big business of the commercial mall, et cetera, et cetera. So you see here a little bit of a mixed reaction with the middle classes. What cannot be disputed was the benefits for big business. There's undeniable in Nazi Germany that big business did exceptionally well under the Nazis. Big companies no longer had to worry about strikes or troublesome trade unions, et cetera, et cetera. Companies like IG Farben, the chemicals giant, gained huge government contracts and was so thoroughly integrated with the Nazi government that in fact, it begins working almost directly with the SS during the war. These huge companies, I mean, IG Farben, for instance, had a plant at Auschwitz, which used slave labor from Auschwitz-Birkenau to produce chemicals. These huge companies got huge government contracts to make explosive fertilizers and even artificial oils in some cases. Other companies that you might be aware of, such as Mercedes and Volkswagen, also benefited greatly from Nazi policy. These companies did fabulously well and certainly benefited by the Volksgemeinschaft. Now let's analyze finally what the Volksgemeinschaft means. Okay, the Nazis did not want Germans to see their society in different social groups. Rather, they wanted it all to be racially pure. They wanted all, let's just say, racially pure Germans to see themselves as part of the national community, or Volksgemeinschaft. Under Nazi rule, workers and farmers would see themselves as German first. At least is what the Nazis wanted. They would be proud to belong to a great nation, and they would put their interests aside, their individual interests aside, and put the interests of the nation, or Germany, above their own. Therefore, all of the measures that the Nazis put in place between 1933 and 1939 were designed to create a loyalty to the Nazi state. And the question is, were they successful? Did these people benefit? Now, in some respects, in many respects, the Nazis did not succeed in this. Germans do not lose their self-interest. Germans do not embrace the national community. On the other hand, they don't totally fail either. Germans do get, through the national community and some of the things that they do, a pretty strong sense of national pride, and certainly loyalty towards Hitler is undeniable. For the majority of Germans, the benefits of Nazi rule, at least the ones on the surface, made them accept some degree of central control in the interests of making Germany great. And I think in some respects the national community is a failure, but in other respects the Nazis did get broadly what they wanted. And that is the end of our little section on life in Nazi Germany. We will be moving on to looking at the economy in the next lesson and how the Nazis transformed the economy in preparation for war. And then we, of course, will get on to what was life like in Nazi Germany and what was the experience of war like in Nazi Germany in lessons 19